TheEndTwo presents The End of Your World, Session 3, Coming Completely Out of Hiding with Adyashanti.
I want to start out here by sharing a story with you. Some years ago, I was on the island of Maui, and I was giving a talk, and I was talking about the truth, and I was more specifically talking about how the truth really manifests in the context of life after awakening. And what I was saying was, what would it be like if we didn't avoid anything we knew to be true? What if we came out of hiding in all areas of our life? What if we stopped avoiding ourselves completely? Because that literally is the awakened life. And so I was talking along these lines, and the evening went by, and there was questions, and then the evening ended, and then the next day there was another meeting. And someone raised their hand, a gentleman, an older gentleman in his midlife, 50s or 60s, raised his hand, and he said something really beautiful. He says, I was listening to you talk last night about truthfulness and really being honest and a willingness to really face oneself as they are and not hide in some past realization. And he said, somehow it penetrated, and I went home. Me and my wife went home. His wife had also come to the meetings with me. And he talked about them going home. And he said, we have been on the edge of divorce for quite some time now. And we went home after we heard you talk, and we just sat down, and we started to tell each other the truth. We started to tell each other what was true for ourselves. And he said it wasn't like when we used to tell each other the truth, which would be more like trying to convince each other of the truth or trying to pretend that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. He said this was telling the truth, which is just very simple. It was almost like confessing exactly what we'd been experiencing, what we'd been experiencing for a long time, confessing the fact that we felt separate from each other and distant from each other, and confessing some of the secrets they had kept from each other, which actually were causing to feel separate and isolated from each other. And he said, we actually just sat there and told each other the truth. He would tell truth, and then he would allow his wife to tell truth, and then he would tell truth and allow her to tell truth. And he said, it wasn't that we were working anything out or trying to come to conclusions. We simply were coming out of hiding. And he said, we literally talked from 11 o'clock at night till 3 o'clock in the morning, which he also said was the reason that he was kind of blurry-eyed and tired at the moment. But he relayed to me that he said it was the most extraordinary evening of his entire life. Just that evening of telling truth, not asserting truth, but not denying truth. Just simply telling truth in a very sincere way, coming completely out of hiding. And I've found over the years of working with people, even people that have had very deep and profound awakenings, that in many people, most people, there's really a fear in them from really being truthful, really being honest, not only with others, but with themselves. And of course, the core of this fear of being truthful and honest and real as a human being is that intuitively, and in most people unconsciously, we all know that if we're actually totally truthful and totally sincere and honest, that at that moment, we can't control anybody. We can't control somebody we've been truthful with. We can't control somebody we've told what seems to be true to. We can only control people if we tell half-truths, if we shade what's true. But if we tell the total truth, then our inside is on the outside. There's nothing hidden inside. For most human beings, to have their inside exposed on the outside brings up incredible fear. Most people walk around feeling like, my God, if anybody could look inside of me if anybody could see what was happening inside of me, what I thought inside of me, what my fears were, and also my doubts were, and also what my truths were, what I really perceive. Most people are terrified that if somebody could do that, they would just feel horrified. So most people are actually protecting themselves. They're holding a lot of things in. They're not actually living really honest and truthful and sincere lives. Because if they were to do so, they would have no control. Of course, they don't have control anyway, but they would have no illusion of control. And so this man and this woman, they both told me about how extraordinary this evening was. And they said, to be quite honest, we don't know if we'll stay together or not stay together. Of course, it's been many years now, and they are still together, but at the time they didn't know if they would be together. But they even had the honesty to say that. They had the honesty to know that they had just made a beginning by telling each other the truth, by being honest, by being real. Most people don't get out of childhood, much less their adolescence, without many times and having many experiences of telling truth and being wounded for telling truth, or having someone say, you can't say that, or you shouldn't say that, or that wasn't appropriate, the situation wasn't appropriate. So most of us human beings have a very deep underlying conditioning that says to be who we are is not okay. That there are times to be truthful and honest, and there are times not to be truthful and honest. Most human beings actually have an imprinting, not only in their minds, but in their bodies and in their emotions, that if they're real, if they're honest, something bad is going to happen. Somebody's not going to like it. And they won't be able to control their environment if they tell the truth. But this is an aspect of awakening. It may not seem like it because it's very human and it's very practical. It's not transcendent. It's not about pure consciousness. But it is about how pure consciousness manifests as a human being in an undivided way. And this is part of the process. The phase of awakening is that what we realize must be able to be manifest. And we also have to come to grips and start to notice the very forces within us that keep us from manifesting it. Now, one of the dangers when I talk about telling the truth to oneself and others is inevitably, almost every time I've given a talk like this in public, at some later point in time, maybe the next day or the next week, someone will come up to me and said, Adya, that talk you gave on truthfulness and honesty and all that? And I'll go, yeah, I remember the talk. And they'll say, well, somebody came up into the parking lot afterwards and decided that they needed to tell me all the rotten things they thought about me in the name of honesty. And I just kind of shake my head and go, oh my God, this is, I hesitate to even give talks on this because it's so easy to misunderstand. Truth is a very high standard. It's not a plaything. To tell what's true within ourselves isn't to tell what we think. It's not to tell our opinion. It's not to dump our sort of the garbage can of our mind onto somebody else. This is what I think about you. This is what I feel about you. This is my judgment about you. None of that's true. That's illusion. That's distortion. That's one's own garbage. It's one's own problem. It's one's projection. What is truth? Truth isn't to unload our opinions onto someone. That's not truth. Truth isn't to tell our beliefs about things. That's not truth. Those are ways that we actually hide from truth. Truth is much more intimate than that. Whenever we tell the truth, it has much more of the sense of a confession. I don't mean a confession of something bad or wrong, but I mean the sense where we come completely out of hiding. Truth is a simple thing. To speak the truth is to speak from a sense of total and absolute unprotectedness. And to do that with any consistency, we have to not only have met every place in ourselves that is afraid of doing that, we have to see what is the belief structure I have that tells me I can't do that. Because those belief structures are by their very nature based in unreality. But just to know that's not enough. You actually have to see it, really perceive exactly what one believes. What are the exact belief structures that cause you to go into duality, that cause you to go into conflict and hiding? And also, part of awakening, part of realizing the inherent freedom of being, if it's true and authentic, if it's real, it's given to the whole world. It's given to everybody. True freedom isn't I'm free. True freedom is everything is free, which means everybody has the freedom to be who they are, whether they're awake or not awake, deluded or undiluted. Freedom is that everything and everybody gets to be exactly that as they are, unless we've come to that point, unless we've seen that that is how reality sees things, then we're actually withholding freedom from the world. We're seeing it as a possession. We're only concerned with ourselves, how good I can feel, how free I can feel. But true freedom, it's a gift to everything and everybody. As the Buddha said upon his awakening, I and all beings everywhere have simultaneously realized liberation. Now, from the conventional mind, that's impossible to understand. If everything woke up, someone may say, then why am I not awake? If the Buddha's correct that the whole world woke up when he woke up, then why am I not awake? I can't really explain that to the conventional mind. What Buddha was communicating was it wasn't the Buddha that woke up. It wasn't this person that woke up. It was the totality and it was the reality that woke up and then was expressing that awakening through this being called the Buddha. But one of the important things about that is allowing the whole world to wake up. Part of allowing the whole world to wake up is the whole world is free. Everybody is free to be as they are. Until the whole world is free to agree with you or disagree with you, until you've given the freedom to each and everybody to like you or not like you, to love you or hate you, to see things as you see them or to see things differently, until you've given the whole world its freedom, then you'll never have your freedom. This is a very important part of awakening. It's an easy part to miss. Again, if we were fully awake, it would be impossible to miss this. But most people don't fully awaken initially, all at once. This is very important, though. Everybody gets to be as they are. And only when everyone is allowed to be as they are, when you've given them that freedom, when you've given them the freedom that they already possess, do you find within yourself the capacity to simply be honest and real and true? Because we can't be true as long as we're expecting or wanting others to agree. That will cause us to contract. Maybe they won't like what I say. Maybe they won't agree. Maybe they'll not like me. This is all ways that we withhold freedom for everybody else. So when we're protecting ourselves, we're also withholding freedom for everybody else. But if one was to look into the very nature of the realization itself, when reality awakens to itself, when we realize that we are the one and only spirit that manifests as everything and everyone, in the very nature of that realization itself is total freedom for all. And there's a certain fearlessness about it. People sometimes come to me and they say, well, Ajahn, there's still some inner place, often a very sort of early childhood place that's afraid to just be what I know to be true. And of course I'll say, well, you have to look at that. See what beliefs got formed. See how you yourself formed certain belief structures based on what happened, until you see that those belief structures aren't really true. But first you got to see them as they are. But also, you have to see that you and we have no way of knowing or predicting how the world will receive us. Part of being awake is being willing to be crucified. I mean, if we think that to be awake is for the whole world to agree with us, we are actually in a total delusion. Jesus found that out. A totally awake being, as they say in Christianity, the Son of God. And what happened to the Son of God? Well, he got crucified, hung on a cross. And inside human consciousness, there is this sort of deep sense of a taboo, as if it's not okay to realize the truth of being. And if you realize it, it's not okay really to just be it. Not go out preaching about it necessarily. I'm not suggesting that. Not shoving it down someone's throat. But just being what you perceive. There's an unconscious taboo within the totality of human consciousness that says that's not okay. You'll be crucified for it. You'll be killed for it. And of course, in our human history, people have been killed for it. People have been crucified for it. We have a long history of getting rid of or killing the truly enlightened beings in many societies, because true enlightenment does not conform to the dream state. In fact, many times the dream state feels offended and threatened by true enlightenment, because a truly enlightened being cannot be controlled. The threat of death can't even control an enlightened being. The death of threat couldn't control Jesus. He was going to live his life out as he was destined to live it out, whether that meant life or death for him. And so, as a human being, we can't have these childish ideas that enlightenment means everybody loves me. Maybe everybody will love you, but more likely some will and some won't. But when you've given the whole world its freedom to like or not like, then you've gone a long way to finding your own freedom. They are tied inextricably one to the other. And besides, the most important thing is not that we try to convince anybody of the truth that we see. That's not so important. What's really important is, are you being truthful with yourself? If you can be truthful with yourself, you can be truthful with anybody and everybody. So there's no real usefulness on becoming overly focused on being truthful with the world and everybody else, although that's necessary. But start with, can you be totally sincere with yourself? Can you go to that place which is beyond blame, beyond judgment, beyond should and shouldn't? Can you go to that place which is so sincere that you won't shy away from any part of yourself that's still in conflict, that you won't use the perception of truth to hide from something that's less than liberated? The question is really a question of sincerity. It's discovering that sincerity. As I said, it's not a self-improvement program. Once you discover this level of sincerity, this level of honesty, you find that sincerity and honesty are manifestations of the absolute nature of being. And to be this sincere with oneself may not initially be easy. We may see things about ourselves that we really don't want to see. We may see the parts of ourselves that stand in seeming stark contrast to everything we've realized, to our own awakening. But nonetheless, awakening itself, that's where it moves. It moves toward and into that which is not awake. And the sincerity is the key. It's what allows it to happen. And it does happen if you're sincere, if you're really real with yourself. And this phase of awakening, of coming completely out of hiding, seeing every point of fixation, every way you go into division, then this part of the journey continues and opens up. And as it opens up, you feel your heart opening and your mind opening. You feel yourself opening on levels that you'd really never dreamed possible. Levels as a human being, not just transcendent of humanness, but also right within your humanness. Because there is no separation between your human being and divine being. A great Zen master, Wang Po, had said that you are no greater for being a Buddha, and you are no less for being manifest as a human being. What he was saying was, they're not separate, they're not different. So although we awaken from the dream state, and we awaken from being the illusion of simply being a human being, still there will be a return, as it were, until we see that human nature and divine nature are one nature, one being, one expression, one truth. And sincerity is the key. You have to be willing. You have to want to see everything. And when you want to see everything, you will see everything.
Session 4, No Center, with Adyashanti.
In many forms of spirituality, we're taught various ways to find our center. Many of the meditative techniques that are suggested, many of the teachings that are taught are often suggestions and pointers to finding a sense of center. And of course, this makes sense because most people are so off balance. Most people have so little sense of themselves. Not only the sense of what they are in the ultimate sense, but most people have very little sense of themselves even as an ego. Their sense of themselves is very conflicted and very torn, and it's a mind state which is moving from one idea or self-image to another, often in opposition and in conflict. But there's a whole other approach, an approach to real awakening. The whole movement towards real awakening really isn't about reinforcing the center. It's really about dissolving the center. And the dissolving of the center isn't necessarily something that we take upon as a goal. Because if we take upon dissolving the center as a goal, that intention to dissolve the center actually comes from the center itself. So the whole movement of awakening itself is actually losing the center, waking up from the center. And what is this center? This center is really our sense of self, our familiar sense of self. Every time we refer to ourself as I, we're actually locating ourself in the infinite expanse and locating a particular point in infinite space and calling that point I. And from that first concept, from that first word, from that first way we talk to ourselves, and we say, I want, or I like, or I don't like, or my opinion is, or I think that that shouldn't be, or I'm loving, or I'm not loving. All these ways, all these descriptions are literally ways that the mind is defining and creating the center. Again, the center in this sense is the center called an illusory self. But through all of our ideas, through all of our beliefs, through all of our opinions, through all of our philosophies, through the almost infinite number of ways in which we define ourself, all these come together and inside of the mind and inside of the body are quickly moving and relating to one another. One thought relates to another. One belief system relates to another belief system. One opinion relates to another opinion. One idea relates to another idea. And through this relationship and through this quickly swirling phenomena of ideas and opinions and beliefs, it creates a center. Not just a center which is an idea, but literally one feels almost physically a sense of center, as if this is where I am. What I am and who I am is at this particular point. For most people, that particular point, of course, is their bodies. That even their physical structure is part of what creates a sense of center. But ultimately, this whole sense of center is an illusion, which means this whole sense of center ultimately is something that's created, or more accurately, it's imagined. It's imagined in the mind. Even the body wouldn't create a sense of center if the mind, with its thoughts and ideas and images, wasn't creating the center first. So all sense of a center, a particular location called me, all begins in the mind. And so human beings, almost all human beings have this sense of center. They really believe that this sense of center is themselves. Their image of themselves creates the experience of the center, their ideas about themselves. And so once this center is created, once this egoic center is manufactured in thought, and then duplicated in feeling and sensation and perception, from that point on, everything gets filtered through this center. Every sense perception, every feeling. When someone speaks to you, their thoughts, their ideas, their speech it comes into your center, it comes into your sense of self, gets filtered through your sense of self, interpreted by your sense of self. And then your sense of self decides whether what it hears or senses is good or bad or right or wrong or worthy or unworthy. And so, in a real sense, this sense of center, which is called a me or an ego, is literally filtering our perception of what is. It's altering our perception of what is. When we're stuck in the center, we don't actually sense anything purely. When we hear someone speaking, we actually hear what we think about what they're saying. We don't hear what they're saying in and of itself. And so it goes with the center continually creating and recreating. Now for the center, for the sense of center, for the sense of a limited egoic existence to continue, this center must be in conflict. It literally has to stay in conflict, otherwise the center is going to disappear. It's going to start to dissolve. So in most human beings, there's this sort of push-pull. There is a pull, there is a yearning for the center to dissolve. Because any time the egoic center dissolves, there's an experience of incredible intimacy, of incredible closeness, of a really exquisite type of union. And yet also, since this center thrives on opposition, it can't actually sustain this closeness for very long. At some point, it will have to come up with a reason why it needs to rebuild the center, why it needs to rebuild itself, why it's necessary to contract. So this is the funny thing about the egoic center, is that it always has to be in some opposition. Of course, it's seeking not to be in opposition. But even if you go to the perfect vacation, if you go to the perfect island in the Tahiti or somewhere where you're left alone, even if everything is perfect, sooner or later the egoic center is going to find something wrong with that perfection. If only that it gets bored, if only that it starts to say to itself, well, I'm not being entertained. Everything's perfect, everything's wonderful, but it's so perfect, it's so wonderful that I'm not entertained anymore. I'm getting bored. And so the center itself can't be satisfied for very long. This is one of the things that the Buddha was pointing out when he was talking about egoic life being equated with suffering, that there's always an element of suffering in egoic existence, because egoic existence must always be in opposition. It must always have an idea as opposed to another idea. It must have an ideology as opposed to another ideology. It must have a belief so that it can be in opposition to other beliefs. And the more that we collect over a lifetime, the more belief, the more opinion, the more fixated concepts we have a greater and greater and greater sense of self. But often, when we have a very great sense of self, we also have a very conflicted sense of self. Because again, this imaginary center thrives and is sustained by conflict. It must be in a state of opposition, more or less continually. People who have tried meditating will find this out. You can sit on a chair or on a cushion, all by yourself, in a room where there's nothing to oppose you, where there's no challenge, where there's nothing happening that you need to address. You can literally sit on a chair all alone in a totally peaceful environment with no threat to the egoic structure. And even in that environment, most egos will still suffer. The mind will be compulsively thinking, one thought against another thought. There'll be anxiety, or maybe there'll just simply be an unbearable sense of boredom after a while, as if the ego does not have opposition, it gets tremendously bored. It becomes tremendously uninterested. So even if we are in environments which are completely safe, eventually the egoic center will find something problematic, something to be in opposition about. And so, really, discovering who and what we are is also itself the dissolving of the center. When we begin to awaken to our true nature, it is the realization that this center called me and I really isn't who we are, really has no inherent suchness, no inherent reality. As the Buddhists would say, that this sense of self is empty. It's empty of inherent reality. That inside this swirling movement of ideas and beliefs and opinions and self-image, that there isn't actually a stable self there. Basically, this sense of center is simply a verb. It's the resistance to what is. It's that which is in a constant state of argument or negotiation with what is or what was or what will be. And it's primarily derived through thought, and nothing but thought initially. As I said, if you want to get a sense of the center, just follow your thinking. When your mind says, I want, in that little thought, if it's believed, you can feel, even in that slight thought, an energetic contraction. I want. You can feel a sense of centering, a sense of coming together, a rallying around that thought. And if that thought is believed, I want or I don't want, you have created, as it were, an imaginary center right in the infinite space of being itself. And all of a sudden there's a sense of separateness. I want, I don't want. I love, I don't love. I'm right, I'm wrong. And when we start to see the nature of this center, all you see, all it is a commentator. It's the mind talking to itself, as if in the infinite expanse of pure awareness and space, there's just thought talking to itself. And through talking to itself and believing what it's saying, it creates these imagined centers, these imagined points of fixation. And so, for most human beings, their whole entire sense of self is this center, is this location. And as I said, it's located for most human beings in their bodies too. That I am here, this is my body, this is where I am. My body and my mind is what I am. Now, many people won't think along those lines, but that's the way they're actually experiencing life. When we start to question the center itself, literally come into it with a questioning mind, and everything the center is saying to itself, I love, I hate, you shouldn't have done that, this shouldn't be happening. Or maybe you're meditating and the center is saying, I wish I could stop thinking, I should stop thinking, I shouldn't feel this way, I should feel more peaceful. And you start to question each of those thoughts. Does this thought have validity? Does it have any truth? Where is the evidence that one shouldn't be thinking? Where is the evidence that says something shouldn't be happening? Where is the actual evidence outside of the mind that says that somebody shouldn't be doing something that they're doing? And when we start to look for the evidence, what we find is the evidence that thought uses as justification is all in the mind. All the evidence of the mind is in the mind. It doesn't come from outside the mind. It's a closed loop. The mind is thinking, it's believing what it thinks, and then it's finding justification for its beliefs in more thinking. This is actually the definition of insanity. It's literally insane to believe thought, to give thought reality. And when we start to question thought, the first question of what am I really and truly? What am I really and truly? Of course, anyone comes to see that when they look at this thought, what am I really and truly? That there's all sorts of other thoughts that are defining themselves. But by examining those thoughts, we see that those thoughts have no real reality. They're almost like just thoughts thinking in empty space. And they're empty of suchness, of truth. And through this sort of inquiry, the center starts to break down. Our sense of self as an entity, as a someone, at a particular location, starts to break down. And consciousness begins to wake up from the center. And we start to realize the center, that person I thought I was, is not actually what I am at all. And one might think, if I was to wake up from the center, then the center would have no power anymore. But it's not initially like that usually. Even once you wake up from the center and you realize, oh, this center, this egoic center, this imagined sense of self, is not really who I am. It still often has a certain power to it. It has a certain momentum to it. You never know when the next thought is going to arise, the next thought that will create a sense of center if it's believed. Now, thought in and of itself is powerless. It's only powerful when we believe the thought. But it is quite a mind-shattering realization that our thoughts hold no reality. And it's not just the thoughts that we don't want to have that hold no reality. It's not just the painful thoughts that hold no reality. It's all the thoughts that we want to believe, that we want to think hold no reality too. And as we see that the thinking structure has no reality to it, there is literally a dropping away of a sense of center. This isn't just an abstract sense of center. It's almost also a physical sense of center. As we begin to awaken to our true nature, who and what we are is centerless. If it has a center, its center is everywhere, which means its center is nowhere. And this itself is what gives rise to a certain initial disorientation as one loses their center. People in the spiritual life, as they start to lose their sense of center, their familiar sense of self, what they don't count on is they're also losing their familiar sense of the world. They're losing their familiar sense of how things work or how things should work. It all starts to disappear under their feet. It's like the ground suddenly starts to fall away. At that point, most people will reach down as if to try to grab pieces of it, to sort of re-grab a certain center. The mind is convinced that it needs a certain center, it needs a belief structure, that it really needs to believe an opinion, that it really needs to have a belief, a theology to hold on to. And so the mind grasps at these. But the true trajectory of true spiritual awakening is that spirit is waking up from its center. And as we wake up from the center, we realize the inherent untruthfulness of the center. But I've wondered many times over the years as I've been teaching, when I've talked to people, I wonder how many people actually want to have no center. It's almost a ridiculous idea. It's a ridiculous thing. How could somebody want to have no center? How could we actually want to have no belief, to have no opinion, or at least if we have beliefs, if we have opinions, to not be able to believe them? I can assure you that I, as a human being, I'm very capable of having certain opinions about certain things. But I'm no longer capable of actually believing my opinions. I no longer think that my opinions are any more valid than anybody else's opinions. There's literally almost an incapacity to even imbibe my own opinions with any reality, with any substance, with any weight. I realize they're just the opinions of a particular body and a particular mind and personality that grew up in a particular culture and has certain leanings towards and away from. So it's not that one needs to destroy their opinions or their preferences. What does get destroyed as we awaken, though, is believing them, is even the capacity to believe them. At a certain point, it literally becomes impossible to believe your own beliefs. It becomes literally impossible to really think that your opinions have more truth and substance and weight than anybody else's opinions. It's as if our sense of reality starts to come out of thought. It comes out of all of the structures of thought. Now, that's why I wonder sometimes who could possibly want that? Because when our sense of reality comes out of our thought structures, out of our beliefs, out of our opinions, out of our familiar sense of self, we realize there's really nothing in awakening for the me, for the imaginary center. The center is destined to dissolve. It's destined to be seen for what it is. Mostly the egoic center is a pain producer. That's what it does. It believes something. It believes the next thought. And as soon as it believes the next thought, it's divided, because one thought is always in opposition to another thought. Good is always in opposition to evil. Right is always in opposition to wrong. Should is always in opposition to shouldn't. And so, thought by its very nature is dualistic. And the center thrives on grasping at polarized thought, at polarized thinking. But it's quite shocking. Through inquiring, through each time the mind starts to grab the next thought, that we actually look at it and see that by grabbing that thought, by grabbing that opinion, even by grabbing our own realization, that each time we grab something, it causes an internal sense of split, an internal sense of anxiety. You can feel the divisive energy moving through your body as soon as you grab and take a thought to be true. And so the beauty of this is we start to see that we have the means of our own freedom within our own hands. Freedom and being chained, happiness and suffering are something that happen completely in the mind. We jail ourselves with our own mind, in our own mind. In truth, there's nobody that has the power to cause us to suffer. And this is a huge realization. This is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to let in, that nobody causes me to suffer except myself. And the only thing that in myself that can cause me to suffer is when I believe a thought that's not true. That's what causes suffering. Without believing in thought, without continually constructing this sense of center, we're actually in harmony with life as it is. Enlightenment is really nothing more than no longer believing your thinking. When you no longer believe the next thought you have, when your reality is not derived by your next thought, you're free. It's as easy as that. It's as simple as that. So in any instant where you're truly not believing any of your thinking, you're free, you're liberated. But in the next moment, you may or may not be liberated if you choose to believe the next thought. If you choose to believe the next judging thought, the next condemning thought, the next fearful thought, you won't feel free anymore. You'll start to feel a sense of isolation and a sense of separation. And so at the beginning of our spirituality, the most important thought to look at is the thought of ourself, of what I am, this I thought. Am I this thought of myself? And all of its defining thoughts, all of its defining images, am I actually the person I think I am? Am I a person at all? And where is the evidence that any of my thoughts are true outside of another thought? This kind of inquiry isn't intended to just simply happen at the level of intellect, at the level of mind. I call true spiritual inquiry meditative inquiry, which means it's really got to be centered also in the body. You've got to be feeling the results of your thinking. You've got to feel the result of what happens when you believe a single thought. You've got to be willing to feel what happens when you see that that thought's not true and your body opens and your energy becomes freed and the sense of center disappears. So true inquiry, true questioning must be meditative, which means it must happen with the body and the mind. We must be able to function as one whole being. Otherwise, inquiry just stays at a mental level. And at a deeper level, as we begin to awaken, the movement of thought becomes much more subtle. Illusion uses much trickier ways to fool us into believing in itself. The ego itself is a shape-shifter. It shifts its shape all the time. If really obvious thoughts of self no longer cause us to go into contraction, maybe subtle ones will. Maybe we'll have a realization, and the mind will grab onto the realization, will turn it into a thought. Then we'll believe the thought. Of course, as soon as we believe the thought about the realization, even when we believe the thought about awakening, then we're no longer awakened at that moment. We're trapped back into the domain of thought and thinking. The center has recongealed itself, which becomes just the next opportunity to question it again in a quiet way, in a sincere way. Each time the mind tries to resurrect the center, we question it. And in the questioning it is the freeing of it and the continuing freeing of it. And of course, as is mentioned in this series of talks, there are many potentials, even in the rarefied atmosphere of awakening. The mind can still come in and create very subtle formulations. The mind will even use the energy of awakening to justify its thinking. But what happens when we see that the domain of thinking, while it may be a useful tool for certain things, a practical tool to get things done or construct buildings or figure out how to create better crop yields, while the mind may be a wonderful tool, that it's not the proper place for us to go and find what reality is. It's not the right place to find out who and what we are. Once we see this at the deepest possible level, the center of the mind begins to collapse. It begins to fall away. There can literally be a sense of almost like falling through space, of really not knowing where you are anymore, of having nothing to grasp onto, nothing to hold onto. This is the nature of enlightenment. There's nothing to grasp onto. There's nothing to hold onto. Literally, there's not even enlightenment to grasp onto. There's not even enlightenment to hold onto. Because we see that there's really nobody to do the holding. That the somebody that would do the holding is just the next thought. The next thought that's believed creates a sense of someone. But when we truly let go, when we truly inquire, the center continually falls away, over and over and over, in more and more deep ways, until the sense of self itself collapses. Even the sense of an enlightened self collapses, is seen to be a dream, a figment of imagination. What becomes of us then? What are we when there's no center? What are we when there is no point of reference? What are we when we cannot reach out, grasp anything, and define ourselves by it? At that point, what we are is really undefinable. And the question is, will we allow ourselves to remain undefinable? Because that's the realm of freedom. To never believe the next definition. Because the next way we define ourselves is a limitation, no matter how we define ourselves. Even to define ourselves through spiritual terms is always a limitation. And amazingly and wonderfully, when finally the tendency to grasp and to define ourselves falls away, strangely enough, we find ourselves everywhere. And only then do we realize it was absolutely necessary for this center to fall away. It was absolutely necessary to see that all the ways we define ourselves and the world and each other in thought was totally illusory. It must be seen as illusory because only then does it fall away. And only then do we start to perceive that everything is of the nature of what we are. Every being is ourself. The next thing we encounter is actually self encountering self. It's God encountering God. It's the divine encountering the divine. And there's nowhere for us to grasp then, because we are at once the most enlightened being ever, and we are also the most unenlightened being. We're the most wonderful saintly being, and we're also the most evil, terrible being. We realize that unity is actually the fact of existence, that everything actually is one. And since everything is one, we are everything. We are what we like. We are what we don't like. We are our friend. We are our enemy. We are the beauty of nature, and we are also the pollution of the big city. We are the terrorist. We are the soldier. We're the abuser. We're the starving child. We're everything that we don't even want to be. And of course, we're everything we always wanted to be. We're the flower and the grass. We're the human being. We're the infinite expanse. Everything. But we only realize this when the center disappears, when we've allowed it through inquiring into it, through examining, through questioning every way that we constrict ourselves through the next thought, and seeing that one thought is never any more true than another thought, that ultimately all thoughts are equally true and equally untrue. Seeing this balances the polarity of thought. And only when the polarity of thought, when one opinion is seen to be just as valid as another, one belief as another, does reality start to disappear out of thought. And does reality start to disappear out of division? The funny thing is, at that point, we can't really say, oh, I'm awakened, I'm enlightened. Because at that point, we are everything and everybody. We are everything and everybody who's enlightened, and we are everything and everybody who's unenlightened. We are the one self. So at that point, what becomes of enlightenment? What becomes of awakening? Who's awake? If it's all one. Everywhere we go, we meet ourselves. Every person we meet ourselves. Everybody that thinks differently than oneself is oneself. The person you disagree with most is also yourself, and equally yourself, and has equal validity as yourself. So this is what's meant by you must lose yourself to find yourself. We must lose ourselves as a particular someone in order to find ourselves as everyone and everything. This is what unconditional love is. This is when we stop pushing one thing away and grasping for another. Because if it's all the nature of ourself, we don't get more of ourself through one thing or another thing. We don't get more of ourself through moving away from one direction towards another direction. We realize that one experience isn't more of the truth than another experience. Everything is just an expression of what we are. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we hang out in some transcendent haze. It's not transcendent, it's not hazy at all. It's actually very grounded, it's very real. The next person you meet is yourself. Your spouse is yourself. If you were to see that, how would you talk to them? How would you talk to your child if you knew your child was literally your own self, your own being? Not as some spiritual theory, not as some sort of transcendent thought process, but actually, when you looked at the next person, the person that's giving you trouble at work, and you intuitively knew without a doubt, my God, that person is actually me in another form. That person is me playing that part over there. That person is me in opposition to me over here. Now how is the relationship going to continue? Now what are you going to do with that perception? The only thing you can know for certain is that when we see from the eyes of one, it transforms the way we interact with each other. It transforms all of life. If it's all one, we don't need to escape life itself, because life itself is ourself. And that which is totally beyond life and existence is also ourself. But as soon as the mind would try to grasp this realization, would try to grasp what I'm speaking of, and make it into a belief, then there'll be the sense of center again. There'll be a sense of limitation. We know that awakening has really happened when we're holding nobody and nothing outside of ourselves. When we're not measuring ourselves against anybody or anything. When we're no longer opposed to life, to no longer being in resistance to life. Some of the thoughts that we will see aren't true are shocking. There are thoughts like life is a disaster. Is it really? Who would you be if you didn't believe that thought? And who would you be if you didn't believe the next thought, or the next thought, or the next thought, or the next thought? Who would you believe if there was nothing to grasp at? What happens when you find out that you are the very thing you resist the most? Then there's nowhere to lay your head, nothing to grasp at. This is my experience of what real freedom is. I know no other freedom except for this freedom. All other freedoms are limited. All other positions thrive on opposition. This is real humility, not the kind of humility that we pretend or recreate, but an authentic humility, an authentic appreciation for what is. It's the deepest calling of all beings to let go of themselves, to let the center called me fall away. And even though it's the deepest calling, the deepest yearning, it's also the deepest fear. Because there's an unconscious fear that letting go of the center, letting go of the idea of me, is literally letting go of what I am. But it's actually simply letting go of what I'm not. So we are pulled towards this letting go, and we are also in opposition to it. And the only answer to this opposition is to question the opposition, because the opposition itself is nothing but the next thought, the next judgment, the next opinion, the next idea. and this is really a new life. Now, strangely enough, in a seeming paradox to what I'm speaking about, as we realize this, life without a center, without the personal center, becomes our reality. Quite paradoxically, as a human being, as the appearance of a particular person, it doesn't mean that we no longer have any experience of that being that particular person. Quite the opposite. We have the experience of being that a particular person, but simply not in opposition to anything or anybody. And that particular person, that body and mind that we inhabit, is no longer seen to be the only body and mind that we inhabit. But strangely enough, as we lose the center, something happens in us. Something eventually starts to bloom. Each being, each person actually has a gift. Something, it's like reality or life is just waiting to express itself through each being in a totally unique way. Totally unique expressions of the One. And we can never know what this completely unique way life will want to express itself through us until we really let go. And in each of us, life is seeking to express itself fully and purely in a way that's totally unrepeatable. This is why we have this innate intuitive draw to beings throughout our history who've not only really let go of themselves and disappeared into the infinite that they are, and then saw everything as one, but these beings also, that realization gave birth to a unique incarnation. Jesus was not a copy of someone else. Buddha was not a copy of someone else. The great beings that we revere, that we put on our altars, are not copies of anybody else. They are examples of life freed up from its fixation, freed from its center, and therefore able to express itself through a particular human being and bloom in a totally unique way, something that's not the product of the past, something that's not the product of simply of the particular culture. It's not a reproduction. It doesn't belong to the human mind. It belongs to life itself. And somehow we intuitively connect with these beings. Something in us is drawn towards them, towards somebody who's let go to such an extent that life was finally capable of expressing itself in a totally new and a totally unique and unrepeatable way. And isn't it ironic that we're so drawn to that kind of being? We revere them as our greatest religious figures. And yet what most of us try to do then is copy them. We try to be like the Buddha. We try to be like Jesus, which is actually in opposition to everything they actually were. Jesus wasn't like anybody. Buddha wasn't like somebody else. That's why they resonate with us. They were pure, undistorted expressions of life itself, which is what we're all called to. And yet our minds are so deeply conditioned to think along certain lines that we think by copying the Buddha, by copying Jesus, by copying this teacher, by copying that teacher, by copying this person, I also will discover my own uniqueness. Life will express itself completely, uniquely through me. But if we do that, all we end up being is a copy. All we end up doing is repeating something. We become the image our mind has, the image our mind creates. And anytime we are living as an image our mind creates, that life is inherently unfulfilling. It has the essence of fear living in it. And so the fulfillment of the whole journey of awakening, of realizing what we really are, is not simply so that we bask in this wonderful realization of freedom. It's something far beyond that. It's something far beyond any personal idea of it or concern. It's so that finally life can express itself through us. That's the rebirth. That's the newborn. And when it starts to move through you, it literally feels like it's something brand new, unrepeatable. And there's an energy to it. There's a harmony with life itself. And that's ultimately the aim, it seems, to life itself, to express itself in a completely whole way where it doesn't divide itself, where it doesn't go into division, but it also is completely free to be as unique as it actually is. This is the inheritance of every single being. This is what we are all called to. All of us are spirit, realizing itself and expressing itself. It's totally letting go of control. Because in truth, we have no control. The center called me has never been in control. It's only had the illusion of control. Seeing through that and letting go of the illusion of control releases a great energy in our lives. An energy that comes not from the center, but from the whole.